They sealed this excavation forever, and no explanation was ever released. The image sticks. Helicopters chopping the humid air above a forgotten ridge in the central Amazon, dust and leaves falling like rain, a line of green trucks crawling up a dirt track, and a group of local men watching from the edge of a forest clearing, as strangers with rolled plans and hard hats marched toward the rock face. That scene in the first months of 1975 is the hinge of a story that refuses to sit quietly in any archive. It is a wound in the map and a blank in the files, a physical hole in the mountain that the state later pretended never existed. Brazil was under military rule. The year was 1975. Large state projects moved with urgency and secrecy. Roads, dams, and extraction projects were cast across the Amazon with the momentum of official will and little public scrutiny. Into that atmosphere came the operation at the ridge, not announced, never authorized in any way the local population could see. For dozens of men who took those jobs, the work paid more than anything they had known. For their families, it offered sudden cash. For the state actors who turned up, the mission arrived wrapped in orders and silence. If this story sounds like something from a spy novel, that is because secrecy is part of what we are trying to explain. But the drama here is not only the presence of secrecy, it is its afterlife. The systematic disappearing of records, the theft and corruption of footage, the administrative footnotes that erase an entire operation from official memory. The excavation was sealed physically, but perhaps more consequentially, it was sealed out of the record. The question we keep returning to is simple and stubborn. Why seal it forever? And who decided that nothing should remain to explain why it had been opened? If this video is reaching you and this story matters to you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Your tip might be the next lead we need. Manuel Ferreira was a carpenter from a riverside village not far from the clearing. He was not a man of institutions or archives. His evidence is the kind a court of papers cannot always capture. Calluses on hands, the way he described the weight of beams, the constancy with which he returned to his tools. In early 1975, Manuel and other men were approached by recruiters at the market. They were told there was work on the other side of the ridge, work that would last for months and pay unusually well. They would be transported, given food and tents, and asked to keep their presence confidential. The accounts of recruitment are consistent across multiple testimonies. Men remembered the trucks arriving at dawn, the uniforms unfamiliar to local eyes, and the hush that followed when the officers gave instructions. Some recalled quietly signing forms. A worker in one interview described a paper with words he could not read. Others said they were asked to sign under the watch of an officer. They were told, work, follow orders, do not take pictures, and do not talk about the site. The pay was cash, and the cash had urgency. For men used to irregular incomes, the arrangement was impossible to refuse. The camp was constructed in a clearing on the ridge, rows of canvas tents, a generator's low thrum, floodlights that painted the night with a hard white, and a fenced area where supplies were stocked. Soldiers moved in discreet patrols. Engineers and foremen, not all military, were seen consulting rolled blueprints. The environment combined industrial noise with the uncanny feel of a place that should not exist in public maps. Diesel engines, the intermittent beep of portable radios, and the metallic clang of rails being laid. What the workers built, and what they first encountered at the rock face, was not a shallow excavation but an entrance that looked engineered. Lines of rusting rails led into a dark throat cut into the stone. The mouth was squared and reinforced. Inside, workers later recalled, supports had been installed as if for regular transit, not a shallow mine. Men described hearing the hum of machinery and seeing steel plates and bolted braces. Even those without technical vocabulary recognized a machine-made order to the opening. It was not a simple shaft or a crudely dug tunnel. It had design. Manuel's recollection of the early weeks is offered as one witness among many, but it shapes the texture of the daily life at the clearing. He spoke about the rhythm of the work, unloading equipment, building timber supports, laying short segments of rail, hauling crushed stone and timber props by hand where machines could not reach. The cast of characters at the edge of the entrance included men in work boots and helmets, some with insignia, some without, and engineers who handed out instructions in clipped tones. There was an insistence on confidentiality that carried weight. Fines, implied threats, and the clear message that these men should not speak of the work when they returned to their villages. Security tightened with time. Soldiers patrolled, radios monitored comings and goings, and movement in and out of the site was controlled. Several men described how they were shuttled to work in different shifts, kept from wandering too far at night, and required to sleep in tents within the fenced camp. The presence of the military lent the operation an official aura. The uniforms made the message clear. This was not a private mining claim, and it was not a municipal road crew. Whether the operation was under an army mandate, a ministerial project, or a hybrid arrangement, that is a key question that goes unanswered in the documents we could find. For months the work advanced. Men grew used to the routine, the descent into humid darkness to lay rails, the clank of steel on stone, the cough of diesel in confined spaces. Families received money, and men returned for periodic breaks, bringing home stories in hushed voices. Then came one day that the witnesses remember in the way a singular hour can become a dividing line between before and after. It began, according to multiple testimonies, with a sound that cut the jungle's usual palate, an explosion, a deep rumble, or a collapse. Witnesses differ on the technical cause, and no official report has been produced to settle the matter. What they agree on is the moment's effect, a cloud of dust that blackened the sun, a thunderous din from inside the tunnel, and an immediate scramble. Men who were nearer to the mouth described seeing earth and debris spew outward. Others heard the screams of men who were inside. Rescue attempts unfolded quickly. Teams ran with lanterns and ropes. Orders were barked, and stretcher parties tried to carry out the injured. But the collapse had trapped men deep in the excavation. Some did not come back. At this point, the narrative becomes fragmentary, and the fragments are painful. Witnesses recall that rescue was chaotic, that soldiers commandeered equipment, that engineers consulted and then withdrew into private tents. Within days, some witnesses say within 48 hours, the operation took a different form. Heavy machinery began to disappear, tents were dismantled in a disciplined way, and a group arrived to seal the entrance. Men who had been inside reportedly remained below. A temporary closure became a permanent act. The mouth was boarded, bolted, buried in places, and finally covered with a layer of rock and soil that made it appear as if the face had never been opened. The sealing itself is central to the story. They did not merely close an entrance and walk away. They made active, visible effort to render it inaccessible. Several men described watchmen posted at the perimeter after the sealing to prevent anyone from approaching. Others remember being paid additional cash and being told bluntly to keep quiet. That night, the assurances were accompanied by warnings, legal repercussions, suggestions that it would be dangerous to speak, and the practical truth that most of the men would not have a record to prove they had worked there in the first place. How many men were inside when the collapse happened is contested. Some workers referred to several, or a few, who did not come out. No definitive casualty list has been produced. Legal and ethical caution is necessary here. We cannot assert a number that is not documented. What we can say based on testimony is that at least some men were known to be missing and that their families were left with unanswered questions. Those missing men became, for the local community, a presence in absence. Their empty hammocks and unfinished tools a daily reminder of the line between what was physical and what was recorded. After the sealing, the camp was quickly cleared. Soldiers loaded vehicles at dawn, leaving fewer and fewer traces with each passing hour. Locals recall the suddenness. One day tents and lanterns, the next day a bare patch on a ridge, and an official silence where there had been constant noise. In the weeks that followed, the men who had worked there were paid off, given small sums, and shown the way back to their villages with strict instructions not to discuss the operation. Those who returned carried an invisible burden. Their stories were surrounded by the smell of diesel and the memory of a sealed mouth of rock. For almost 2 decades, the ridge lay mostly quiet in public memory. Stories circulated in small circles, in bars, at river markets, among family members. But no official ledger, no contract in municipal hands, no public tender appears to match what the witnesses describe. When scholars, journalists, and relatives later started to ask formal questions, they hit a wall of administrative absence. The first person in the modern record to act on the rumors was geologist Augusto Pinheiro. In 1994, he heard accounts from locals and decided to locate the clearing. Augusto's expedition found physical traces that matched what veteran workers had said. A linear trail where rails had been laid, holes in the scree consistent with the placement of supports, and at the mouth of the so-called excavation, a heavy covering that hid a scar in the stone. Augusto photographed the site and wrote an account that circulated in 1995. His photographs show a face of rock altered by human hands and the surrounding ground disturbed in a way that suggested recent industrial activity relative to its surroundings. Augusto's work did not by itself bring closure. He described the place and its artifacts, but he could not find central documents explaining who had set the operation in motion. His publication planted the seeds for a public record. It also set into motion interest from others who wanted to verify the phenomenon. Those who followed would find an odd combination of vivid physical evidence and an absence of official paperwork. In 2003, an independent documentarian, Ricardo Mendez, visited the site with a small crew. Ricardo filmed the ridge, the sealed mouth, and the scattered artifacts that time and weather had not yet swallowed. A short length of rusted rail, a crushed helmet with the edge split by force, pitted tool marks on anchor points, and the faint stamp of vehicle tracks that led away before fading into a regrown track. Ricardo recorded interviews with surviving workers, men like Manuel, and captured their voices, the cadence of their recollection, and the texture of their disbelief that an entire operation could be rendered invisible in the record. Ricardo's footage became, for a period, the most accessible visual record of the excavation in contemporary media. He compiled testimony, aerial shots, and close-ups of the hardware left behind. The documentary, later shown in small festival circuits under the title O Túnel Fantasma da Amazônia, pushed the story into a broader light. But the life of documentary evidence is fragile. In the years that followed, Ricardo reported incidents that would add another layer of suspicion and difficulty to any attempt at reconstructing events. Backups of his material were stolen or corrupted, some tapes went missing, and online copies disappeared after server failures. Whether those losses were the result of neglect, theft, technical failure, or something more intentional, remains a question for which we lack conclusive proof. What is indisputable is that the audiovisual record around the site was weakened, and with it the ability to build an unambiguous public narrative. Parallel to this, attempts to find official paperwork met with a consistent pattern of no records. Freedom of information style requests and visits to institutional archives, the Army, the National Department of Mineral Production, DNPM, and others, returned denials, or in some cases, statements that no holdings matched the descriptions investigators provided. A repeated phrase in formal letters and interviews was, "No records pertaining to this operation were located." The absence becomes in itself an evidentiary problem. How does a large organized excavation with soldiers, heavy equipment, and dozens of workers leave no trail in official departments that normally register such projects? The puzzle was now twofold: a physical entrance that could be seen and described, and a bureaucratic silence wide enough to be read as intent. Years later, the area received a different kind of administrative attention. Local preservation authorities placed the ridge within a zone earmarked for protection, a move that carried the official language of conservation, but also left a paper trace that seemed to conflate two distinct states, protection and oblivion. The same map that marked the ridge as preserved also made the excavation's history harder to access. A protected designation limited new digs, new surveys, and even certain kinds of archival fieldwork. Some saw this as a protective measure for the landscape. Others read it as an additional barrier to knowing what had happened decades before. The administrative record, like the physical terrain, became contested. On the ground, the artifacts that remained told fragments of the story. Rusted rails ended in blind earth where they had once entered the throat of the excavation. A battered helmet lay half buried under leaf litter, its liner collapsed but enough of its shape remaining to suggest sudden force. Tool marks pocked anchor stones where supports had once been fixed. The trails leading up the ridge carried the faint tread of heavy tires, but the tracks faded before they joined any municipal road recognized on official maps of the time. Witnesses and investigators cataloged these items carefully. Augusto's 1995 photographs captured the geometry of the site. Ricardo's footage added the human voices to that geometry. Together, their work made the physicality of the excavation undeniable. Yet in every document, every photograph, and every frame of video, one fact persisted as stubborn and strange. The operation was sealed physically, and the surrounding paper trail had been sealed just as thoroughly. The human consequences of that sealing are not just archival. Families asked about lost relatives and received no official confirmation. Men who returned from the clearing told of nightmares and unexplained illnesses. They were paid to be silent, but paying does not settle grief. The possibility that the collapse claimed lives is repeated in testimony. What is not available is a death certificate or an official registry entry that could transform private loss into a legal fact. In the absence of such records, the missing exist between memory and paper, real to those who remember them, invisible to any system that records existence. It is here at the intersection of physical evidence and bureaucratic absence that the story becomes not only local, but emblematic. The power to make things vanish from files is a power of the state. The ethics of such vanishing, whether it is negligence, damage control, or deliberate erasure, demand scrutiny. Investigative work in this case has been pursued by a small cohort of committed individuals. Geologists who can interpret the scars in the rock, documentarians who can make witness testimonies legible again, and journalists who push at the doors of institutions that prefer them closed. But the road to answers is rocky. After Ricardo released his film, he reported intimidation and interference. Equipment disappeared from his car after a screening. A hard drive containing raw interviews suffered unexplained corruption. Photographs that had been shared with local archives later could not be located. This pattern, physical traces, witness testimony, and then a sequence of interference with the record, is a recurrent motif in the history of this excavation and in the stories of other contested sites. Each missing item, each corrupted drive narrows the slender bridge between eyewitness memory and public record. Some institutional responses have been formal and explicit. Requests to the Army and to the DNPM have returned replies indicating either no holdings or no knowledge of an operation of this nature in the relevant year. These denials are not the same as evidence that no operation occurred. They are, however, significant. When the institution most plausible to hold records denies any holdings, investigators must press further. Cross-check payrolls, search municipal ledgers, subpoena suppliers, and interview survivors until the story's contours begin to cohere. That is exactly the labor that happened in fits and starts over the decades following the sealing. In the absence of a smoking gun, no explicit order bearing the Army's stamp, no contract with a mineral license number, the story remains a collage of credible fragments. There are moments where a single artifact seems to contradict the neatness of institutional denial. A photograph of a stamped metal plate, partially corroded but bearing a legible factory mark, suggests that equipment came from a particular industrial source. A receipt, preserved in a worker's pocket, records a supply purchase dated to the weeks around the excavation. These small items are the connective tissue that investigative work seeks to expand. But when larger documentary caches, official files, contractor ledgers, supply manifests, are not found, the isolated evidence becomes suggestive rather than conclusive. The longer the story lives unclosed, the more it invites alternative readings. Locals offer theories shaped by what they know. Mining could explain the rails and the short-lived infrastructure. A storage facility or underground warehouse might fit the reinforced entrance and the military presence. Darker possibilities, clandestine detention or experiments with materials unsuitable for civilian oversight, appear in the margins of interviews as fears and conjectures. Each theory finds support in certain physical facts and meets problems when confronted with the absence of corroborating documentation. The absence itself becomes evidence of a different sort. Evidence of erasure, or evidence that the operation was of a kind not meant to be recorded in ordinary registries. Augusto, Ricardo, and others who have tried to make sense of the excavation have been careful to separate hypothesis from proved fact. That methodological caution matters, because the stakes are not only historical, they are personal. Accusing an institution without documentation risks defamation. Asserting a cause of death without a certificate risks cruelty. Guessing at foreign involvement without declassified proof risks sensationalism. Yet it is precisely the refusal to allow institutional silence to stand unchallenged that motivates investigative work. So long as the physical scar remains, so long as men like Manuel carry memory, there will be an obligation to press. And press, they did. Following Ricardo's film and Augusto's photos, small teams of independent researchers returned to the ridge at different intervals. They carried metal detectors, sample bags, and notebooks. They mapped the area with more precision than the earlier visitors could achieve, plotting GPS points where rails ended and marking depressions that might hide sealed access points. They took soil samples, sought radiometric anomalies, and looked for the chemical signature of explosives or industrial fluxes that might explain a collapse. Scientific work, however, requires stable access to a site and time. Both are limited when the area is subject to administrative protection and when local sentiment runs to caution. On one visit in the late 1990s, a small team reported that an attempt to remove a surface slab at the mouth of the sealed entrance produced only a small shifting of rubble, and then the arrival of uniformed personnel who demanded that the team stop. The personnel did not produce an arrest warrant or a written order. They offered verbal instructions and left. Incidents like that complicated the simple desire to gather evidence. The message was clear to investigators. Fieldwork would be possible only so far. Back in town, the social dynamics were complicated as well. The men who had been at the camp were aging. Some had died. More had moved away. Those still alive expressed resentment at being asked to revisit painful memories for the sake of journalists. Families feared trouble if they spoke. They feared that employment opportunities could dry up if they were seen as troublemakers in small, tight-knit communities. For a human story to survive in such a context, it needs both voices willing to speak and institutions willing to respond. The first few decades did not provide the second. That is why the rediscovery efforts of Augusto and Ricardo mattered. They created a public trace that could be followed by others. They also made themselves targets of the fragility of documentary evidence. Losing footage or finding drives corrupted is not a mere technical inconvenience in a story where paper is already missing. It is another narrowing of the channel through which memory might travel into public record. At the same time, the presence of the sealed mouth and the physical artifacts made the site impossible to dismiss entirely. When we stand, in imagination or in photographs, at the spot where rails vanish into the ground, the contradiction is concrete. Here is the work of many hands. There is the literal trace of a built passage, and yet official memory often refuses to name it. The discrepancy between what the land remembers and what the files record forces an ethical question upon anyone who studies the case. Who is responsible for bearing witness when institutions erase their own traces? What does justice look like when there is no paper trail to support a claim of loss? These are not questions that yield to quick answers. They require time, cross-disciplinary effort, and in some cases, the courage to confront vested interests. For families of those missing, such work offers the possibility, only the possibility, of recognition. For historians, it is the obligation to document. For the state, if it ever engages, it would be the obligation to explain discrepancies in public record. Yet, even as concern for ethics and method shaped the work of investigators, an undercurrent of intimidation persisted. Scattered accounts of men being threatened, of tapes going missing, and of formal institutions replying with denials accumulate into a pattern that is, at minimum, obstructive. Whether that pattern results from intentional erasure, bureaucratic incompetence, or the uncoordinated consequences of secrecy in an authoritarian era is a central point of investigation. What is certain is that the sealed excavation remained, physically present on the ridge, and absent in the paper world where operations like it are usually registered. The story of the sealing therefore unfolds on two planes: the material plane of rails, helmets, and rebar, and the textual plane of contracts, payrolls, and departmental memos. The most unsettling fact, repeated by investigators over years of work, is that those two planes do not align. They cannot be reconciled by a single missing file or a clerical error. Instead, the misalignment is widespread enough to raise the possibility that the absence of records is systemic, not incidental. This realization, that the state can, in practice, make entire operations vanish from common record, is what gives the story its contemporary urgency. It is not merely a mystery for armchair speculation. It is an inquiry into the mechanics of memory, the limits of accountability, and the vulnerabilities of communities whose histories are not embedded in durable paper or digital chains. It is at this point that the investigation broadens from describing a single event to mapping a pattern. The sealed entrance at the ridge becomes, for some, emblematic of a larger capacity to render past actions invisible. If the sealing was physical, the subsequent administrative silence was its complement. The effect is to leave behind a living archive composed of testimony, damaged artifacts, and a handful of photographs. An archive that resists the simple certainties of official record-keeping. It is here, amid the rust and the fragments, that investigators chose their next moves, to push institutions for answers, to gather scattered artifacts before they vanish, and to protect the testimonies of aging witnesses whose memories might otherwise be lost. They sealed this excavation forever, and no explanation was ever released. That statement is both a description of an action and a provocation. It insists that a single act of closure should not equal permanent silence. The men who cleaned up the site and the hands that removed the equipment did more than clear dirt. They attempted to make forgetting practical. Our task then is to render remembering practical again, to assemble fragments, to corroborate testimony, and to keep asking the simple question that the title poses. In the next phase of this story, investigators would push deeper into institutional archives, attempt forensic analysis of material traces, and weigh competing theories about why such an operation would have existed in the first place. Each possible explanation, mining, a storage installation, clandestine detention, a rogue project, or something involving external contractors, has to be tested against what the land and the witnesses say, against the silence of the paperwork, and against the suspicious pattern of interference that has shadowed researchers for decades. For now, the ridge keeps its secret in the folds of rock and bureaucracy. Witnesses like Manuel keep their memories in the lines of their hands and the cadence of their speech. The sealed excavation remains both a physical object and a moral question that asks to be pursued. Investigators return to the ridge armed with patience, clipboards, and the uneasy knowledge that every avenue of proof they pursued could itself be obstructed. The work that followed was slow, procedural, and sometimes humbling. List after list of institutions to query, suppliers to track, and people to interview. If the sealed excavation had been an isolated physical act, then answering why it had been sealed required moving it into public paperwork, into payrolls, permits, transport manifests, supply orders, the banal bureaucracy that normally documents large-scale labor and heavy equipment. That was where the trace should have been. That was also where the trace most clearly seemed to be missing. Formal requests were lodged in municipal offices, in state ministries, and with federal bodies that would logically have intersected with such an operation. The Army responded to several direct inquiries with a variation of the same sentence. No holdings matching the description were located. DNPM records returned similarly empty, or in some cases, unrelated references that did not map onto the scale witnesses described. INCRA and the Ministry of Mines and Energy either reported no records or offered procedural hurdles, requests redirected to other departments, citations of lost files, and bureaucratic forms that prolonged the process. These official replies are part of the public record of the investigation. Not proof of conspiracy, but evidence of absence that demands interpretation. Absence, however, is not proof of nothing. It might be clerical misfiling, the vagaries of record-keeping in a decades-old authoritarian bureaucracy, or simple loss during administrative reorganizations. It might also be intentional. The difficulty of distinguishing these possibilities is the tension at the heart of the investigation. Each new dead end, a box of files never cataloged, a contractor's ledger that cannot be found, a supplier who remembers a purchase vaguely but cannot produce a receipt, deepened the ethical dilemma. How aggressively to suggest culpability when the documentary chain is so fragmented? Field teams tried to move the problem from paper back into the material. Metal detectors swept the ground near the sealed mouth. Soil samples were bagged for later testing. Small fragments of rail and a helmet fragment were taken for conservation. Where possible, researchers documented their work with timestamps and witnesses so that, even if the larger institutions remained silent, there would be a chain linking field finds to public testimony. That chain, too, proved fragile. On more than one occasion, equipment was reported missing from vehicles parked overnight. On more than one occasion, data files containing raw footage were later found corrupted. Those incidents are recorded in investigators' notes and in police reports filed at different times, but the reports do not resolve why the losses happened, whether by opportunistic theft, negligent storage, or targeted interference. At the same time, the Ridge's administrative life continued to complicate field access. IBAM's later action to designate the area as protected, a move framed by conservation language, introduced legal restrictions on excavation and disturbance. Preservation in principle is a safeguard. In practice, it added a layer of permission that researchers had to negotiate. Some local activists argued that protection was necessary to shield an environmentally sensitive site from opportunistic digging. Others worried that the protective zoning had the side effect of preventing forensic recovery of evidence that could answer the most basic questions about the 1975 operation. Whether IBAM's designation was driven by conservation, by institutional caution, or by other pressures is unclear in the documents available to researchers. The bureaucratic record shows only the outcome, a protected parcel on a map that made some investigative techniques legally complicated or infeasible. Because physical sampling could only go so far under these constraints, investigators turned again to human witnesses. Locals who had seen the trucks, who had signed the forms they could not read, who had stood and watched the men march toward the rock face were re-interviewed in a patient, repeated way. Oral history methods demanded sensitivity. Many witnesses had been asked explicitly to forget the operation. Many had internalized that instruction through fear or silence. Interviewers worked to establish rapport and to corroborate specifics, the cadence of transport schedules, the descriptions of foremen, the kinds of equipment seen. Some memories sharpened with retelling, other recollections blurred. Memory, after decades, is itself a fragile archive. Within that mosaic of memory and metal, 5 broad theories emerged in public debate and in investigators' notebooks. Each theory offered explanatory power for some aspects of the site and faced notable gaps elsewhere. It is essential to list them as hypotheses, not as proven accounts. Theory 1. Industrial mining or prospecting operation. Evidence for rails and reinforced tunnel mouth, rusted short rail segments suggesting transport, presence of engineers and heavy machinery consistent with excavation aimed at extraction, local accounts of earth-moving equipment. Evidence against: no record of a formal mineral concession or supplier chain in DNPM files. Lack of visible tailings typical of full-scale mineral extraction in aerial photos of the immediate area, and the geological mismatch some investigating geologists suggested between the immediate ridge composition and the types of deposits usually pursued with rail-based shafts. In other words, mining fits many surface-level indicators, but key bureaucratic and geological records that would normally accompany legitimate mining remain elusive. Theory 2. Underground storage, bunker, or logistical installation. Evidence for reinforced entrance, evidence of bolted braces and structural supports, military presence and security measures that would be consistent with a protected facility, the rail configuration that might suit small-scale cargo movement into a secured cavity. Evidence against: absence of clear logistical roads or maintained access routes connecting the site to larger supply networks, lack of documentary procurement for storage infrastructure, and the seeming impracticality of burying such a structure so thoroughly, unless the operation had been either abruptly terminated or designed from the start to be easily closed and hidden. Theory 3. Clandestine detention or secret facility linked to security operations. Evidence for the secrecy around recruitment, the military presence, forced silence among workers, and the immediate sealing after a catastrophic event, elements that fit patterns of state secrecy in Brazil's authoritarian era. Evidence against: no documented orders, no detainee records, and no corroborating testimony from people who might have been tasked with guarding detainees rather than construction. Importantly, suggesting clandestine detention has gravest ethical implications. It risks assigning criminal intent without documentary proof. The only responsible position here is to acknowledge that testimony and the presence of soldiers create plausible grounds for such a theory, while insisting that it remain an unproven possibility. Theory 4. Rogue or poorly supervised technical project by a contractor with state endorsement but minimal paper trail. Evidence 4. Use of non-military engineers, the contractual-looking nature of some field organization, and reports of stamped equipment plates linking to particular manufacturers. Evidence against: lack of supplier invoices traceable through municipal procurement systems, and the unusual direct involvement of soldiers in what might otherwise be a private contractor's project. This theory reconciles some of the paperwork gaps if contractors were paid informally or through off-the-books channels. But it also raises questions about oversight and accountability. Theory 5. Foreign collaboration or technology importation. Evidence for certain reports of specialized plates and hardware not routinely seen in local projects at the time, and witness impressions that some machinery seemed uncommon in rural Amazonian work sites. Evidence against: no explicit documentation of foreign contracts, no travel or customs records unearthed that would indicate importation of specialized equipment, and the lack of corroborating diplomatic or commercial records. Exceptional equipment alone does not prove foreign involvement. Each of these theories is partial, illuminating certain angles while leaving shadows elsewhere. They are not mutually exclusive. The site could have been a hybrid, a temporary logistics node for a larger scheme that mixed state and private actors, or a project that started as legitimate industrial work and ended in emergency measures that severed any normal paper trail. The other constant is the way each theory bumps up against the same stubborn absence: the lack of clear, traceable paperwork that would ordinarily anchor institutional responsibility. Experts who have examined the physical traces emphasize that tangible artifacts matter most where paperwork is missing. A short length of rail, photographed and analyzed, shows manufacturing tolerances consistent with industrial-grade track. A crushed helmet's deformation can be cataloged and conserved. Anchor bolt holes on an exposed face can be mapped and compared with known engineering schematics. But material analysis requires chain-of-custody discipline and storage that, in this case, has often been lacking. When Ricardo's team lost backups of footage and months of raw interviews, the ability to triangulate field observations with spoken testimony diminished. Losing documentary and audiovisual backups is not merely a technical annoyance here. It is a substantive loss of evidence and memory that widens the gap between what the land remembers and what the archive records. The human cost of that gap returns us to the people themselves. Families of those who did not return, or who returned damaged by trauma, injury, or illness, were left without the legal anchoring of death certificates or formal accident reports. In Brazil, as in many countries, the absence of a public record complicates compensation, denial of benefits, and the broader recognition that a life was lost to a worksite catastrophe. It also affects collective mourning. Some relatives told interviewers that they felt they could not mourn publicly because there was no paper to anchor their grief. Absent a certificate, absent enrollment in a funeral fund, their sorrow was administratively invisible. Those are not minor grievances. They are material disadvantages that ripple outward into pensions, inheritance, and social standing. Across decades, the number of living original workers dwindled. Of the 18 men originally identified as having worked at the site, fewer than half were alive by the time later investigations deepened. Age, migration, and a reluctance to revisit traumatic memory further reduced the pool of living witnesses. Manuel, an anchor figure of earlier accounts, died in 2018. His passing removed one of the clearer human threads linking the community to the ridge. Yet his conversations about the weight of beams, the hush upon orders, the suddenness of the collapse, remain in recorded interviews and in the memories of those who spoke with him. Their preservation is precisely what investigative work aims to secure. Legal avenues were explored with varying degrees of success. Lawyers and rights organizations advised families about possible claims, seeking civil recognition, pressing for municipal inquests, or requesting reclassification of missing persons. The problem was not merely legal strategy, it was procedural access. Courts require evidence, registries require documentary triggers. Where records are missing, legal processes stall or divert into long procedural fights. That delay, in turn, takes a moral toll on families who seek closure. Public attention matters in cases like this because publicity can prod institutions to respond. Ricardo's documentary briefly created that public pressure. Screenings drew local audiences, and the film circulated in juried festivals. For a moment, the Ridge moved from rumor into a visible story. But even when a story enters public view, sustaining momentum is difficult. Media cycles move on, archival searches go cold, interest fades. In this case, the fragility of documentary evidence meant that when attention waned, so did some of the practical ability to pursue lead generation. Lost backups, corrupted drives, and vanished photographs are not only losses for investigators, they are losses for the public record. In their place, a stubborn refrain remained, sealed forever. No explanation. So what can be done? Investigators and community members pursued several parallel strategies, mindful of legal and ethical constraints. One path was archival pressure, coordinated requests across multiple agencies seeking the same type of records, combined with public requests that make obstruction politically costly. Another path was community archiving, collecting oral histories, preserving photographs in multiple geographically dispersed digital repositories, and training local custodians to manage physical artifacts so that they remain in community control rather than disappearing into fragile private collections. A third strategy involved scientific caution. Any new sampling or excavation would need robust permissions, conservation plans, and legal backing to ensure it did not inadvertently destroy evidence in the name of discovery. All these paths require resources, time, and sustained public interest. They also require trust building with local communities who have borne the costs of secrecy. Investigators learned that promising quick answers was irresponsible. Offering careful documentation, legal support, and the promise of respectful collaboration was not only ethical, but pragmatic. Families were far likelier to participate when they saw that the process respected their memories and their anxieties. Institutional engagement remained the critical bottleneck. When ministries and departments responded to formal inquiries, their replies often contained procedural language rather than substantive disclosure. The investigators who read those replies had to parse bureaucratic posture from potential concealment. A line that says, "No holdings located," might mean genuinely empty archives, files misfiled under a different procurement code, or folders removed under classified protocols decades ago. Without an ability to subpoena or to access classified records, researchers could only keep pressing, appealing, and litigating for further declassification. That litigated route is slow. It is also in many ways the only way to force an institutional response when routine transparency fails. The history of authoritarian regimes shows how decisions made in one era can cast long shadows. Military governments often classified projects and kept records in separate, sometimes unindexed, series. After transitions to civilian rule, some records were declassified while others were archived in inaccessible ways, lost in institutional reorganizations, or simply discarded. That historiographic reality does not resolve the case at the Ridge, but it helps explain a portion of the absence. The larger issue remains. Sealing a physical entrance and an administrative paper trail is not the same act. Together, however, they create an effective erasure. The ethics of that erasure are not purely academic. They relate to accountability and to the dignity owed to people who worked, suffered, or died in these operations. If an institution orders secrecy for reasons of national security, it bears the moral obligation to account for human cost. If an operation was mismanaged or led to avoidable deaths, The families affected are owed truth and reparations. If records were lost through incompetence, there is a duty to restore them or to document the loss transparently. The paradox here is that secrecy aimed at protecting interests can create a long-term harm, the silencing of lives. As investigators pressed, new leads occasionally surfaced. An old municipal clerk remembered issuing pass permits around 1975 and located a ledger containing an entry that might correspond to supply shipments to an unnamed project. A retired truck driver remembered hauling equipment and produced a faded invoice stub. These small marginal documents rarely provide the full answer, but they are the kind of connective tissue that can link oral testimony to institutional action. Over time, accumulating such fragments, stamped plates, purchase stubs, eyewitness statements tied to dates, can create a reasonable narrative even without a single smoking gun directive. That is painstaking work, and it typically unfolds at the scale of months and years rather than weeks. What the ridge resists is a tidy narrative. Its materiality argues that something significant happened: rails, helmet fragments, reinforced mouth, and the memory of men who were paid to work and then warned to be silent. Its bureaucracy, by contrast, provides cover and confusion. No centralized ledger, agencies passing responsibility, and a protective zoning that complicates new inquiries. The result is an unresolved historic object, visible in the landscape, invisible in files, alive in memory, and frustrating to legal frameworks that require documentary certainty. In thinking about next steps, investigators emphasized procedures that protect memory while seeking accountability. That includes building redundant archives, multiple copies of interviews and photographs stored in different physical and digital places, and securing legal agreements that allow for forensic work in ways consistent with conservation and local consent. It also includes public pressure. The more the story circulates in scholarly circles, in human rights networks, and in media, the more political cost there is in maintaining silence. That is not a guarantee, but it has been effective in other cases where prolonged attention led to reopened files and new disclosures decades after the events. At the same time, investigators must remain ethically disciplined. Accusing institutions or individuals without firm evidence would be irresponsible and potentially harmful to families and communities. The work, therefore, remains structured around a clear ethic: gather, document, corroborate, and publish what can be supported while labeling the rest as hypothesis. That discipline is not a tactic of avoidance. It is a moral commitment to accuracy and to preventing the re-traumatization of victims by speculation. The sealed excavation story also raises deeper questions about historical memory in places where state projects intersected with vulnerable communities. How many other sites exist where landscape scars outlast paper records? How many families carry unpaid costs tied to operations that the state did not document? These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are practical research agendas that invite comparative work. Mapping similar cases across regions could reveal patterns: recurring modes of administrative silence, repeated use of local labor under confidentiality, and institutional tactics of post-facto protection that conflate conservation with obstruction. In the months after Ricardo's film circulated, and after Augusto's photographs were shared more widely, a modest network of scholars, local activists, and family members formed an informal working group. Their goals were modest at first: preserve what remained, collect oral histories from surviving workers and relatives, and build a dossier that could be presented to a national archive or to sympathetic academics who might take interest. The group's work is the kind of slow, quiet labor that rarely makes headlines, but is essential for historical recovery. It is also often the only feasible approach when official cooperation is limited or delayed. One striking feature of the story is how material traces invite moral imagination. When we look at a crushed helmet, half buried in forest litter, we are confronted by a human detail that paper cannot erase. That helmet belonged to some person who walked that ridge, who had a family, a name, obligations, and future plans. No institutional memo can replace the shock of seeing such an artifact. That is why field conservation and community storage of artifacts have become priorities. Objects anchor memory in ways that documents sometimes fail to do, and they help resist the quieting effect of administrative absence. As the working group matured, It tried to formalize channels for tips and leads. People who had once been afraid to speak found ways to communicate confidentially. Some came forward with names of suppliers, others with the memory of a vehicle license plate, one with an invoice refund stub tucked into an old Bible. Each small item matters because the cumulative weight of many small items can create a credible chain. Bureaucracies are often clumsy, but they are also predictable. Procurement leaves traces, and traces can be pieced together with patient research. Even with promising leads, the problem of lost audio-visual material remained acute. Ricardo's corrupted hard drive and missing backups were a painful example of how fragile documentary memory can be in the face of theft, degradation, or indifference. The working group therefore prioritized digital preservation, multiple redundancies, cloud storage with broad access controls, and physical preservation of tapes and negatives in climate-controlled environments where possible. Protecting evidence from loss is a prosaic but indispensable part of any investigative strategy. There is also the broader public question of accountability. Who, if anyone, should answer for the erasure? That is a complicated legal and moral question that cannot be resolved by a single video. What is practical is to insist on transparency. Call for an independent audit of agency archives for the relevant period. Request that any relevant classified files be reviewed by a judicial authority with the power to compel release. And urge conservation agencies to adopt policies that permit limited, non-destructive investigative work when historical questions of public interest are at stake. Such requests are not revolutionary. They are appeals to normal democratic processes of oversight and record-keeping. As the working group prepared a public dossier, they took care to frame conclusions conservatively. They documented what could be established: the presence of material evidence on the ridge, the testimonies of recruited workers, the sequence of a collapse followed by sealing, and the pattern of missing records. They also cataloged uncertainties: the lack of a definitive causal account for the collapse, ambiguous results from limited material testing, and the fragility of documentary evidence due to corruption and theft. That catalog of facts and lacunae is crucial for any responsible historical presentation. In the end, the ridge resists a single narrative precisely because it sits at the intersection of many kinds of power: technical, military, bureaucratic, and social. Each of those powers left a mark, some visible, some deliberately hidden. The sealing of the excavation was an act with immediate practical consequences. It stopped access, it removed the site from active use, and it imposed silence on those who had worked there. The subsequent administrative erasure, the missing files, the denials, the protective zoning, extended that silence into the present. Together they created an absence that is difficult to penetrate. The last public act in the documented timeline was not dramatic. It was administrative. The map that now bears a protected designation shows the ridge as conserved, its name sanitized in formal cartography, its scar covered by a legal line. That act, perhaps intended to protect forest, also complicates historical inquiry. It is a reminder that official acts have multiple possible meanings and that the consequences of such acts can be ambiguous. So where does that leave us as investigators and as a public? The immediate answer is not satisfying. There is no single revelation that resolves the central question posed by the title. We do not possess an archive of command orders proving intent. We do not have a payroll ledger naming every worker. We do not have a definitive forensic report explaining a collapse. What we do have is a pattern of material evidence and a pattern of administrative silence that together demand attention. We have the testimonies of workers and families who were paid and warned to forget. We have photographs and degraded footage that document a physical intervention in the ridge. We have institutional replies that, by their emptiness, demand further scrutiny. This case therefore remains an open inquiry, not because researchers lack dedication, but because the very actors most likely to hold decisive records remain opaque or defensive. It is an inquiry that requires patience, legal muscle, and a public that is willing to keep asking questions long after the initial drama has passed. It is also an ethical challenge, to protect witnesses, to avoid sensational claims, and to pursue truth without using victims as props for dramatic narratives. They sealed this excavation forever, and no explanation was ever released. The phrase is both accusation and plea. It accuses the historical record of omission. It pleads for continuing curiosity. The ridge sits with its hidden mouth, a wound in the map, and a silence in the files. It is a material object that invites material inquiry, and it is a moral object that invites public attention. If you have information about this site, documents that may relate to procurement or transport in the region in 1974-1976, or family stories that have not been shared publicly, please come forward. Any tip, a faded invoice, a memory of a license plate, a photograph tucked into an album, could be the small detail that completes a larger picture. Support for careful, ethical investigative work also makes a difference. Preserving interviews, conserving artifacts, and pursuing legal avenues requires sustained resources. For now, the ridge keeps its secret in stone and bureaucracy. The men who labored there and the families who still live with the aftermath deserve that we do not let it vanish entirely. History is often an act of persistence, accumulation of fragments until a plausible whole emerges. We will continue to gather those fragments, to press institutions for answers, and to preserve what witnesses remember. The sealed excavation remains an open wound in the record, a reminder that official silence is not the same as historical absence, and that memory, preserved patiently, can force institutions to reckon with what they have chosen to forget. They sealed this excavation forever, and no explanation was ever released. We will keep asking why. If you can help, reach out, share this story, and hold the memory of the ridge in circulation so that one day the silence may be replaced by answer, or at least by a fuller public accounting of what happened on that ridge in 1975.